One quiet morning, my stepson slammed a stack of debt papers onto the kitchen table. "Sign them," he demanded. I looked him in the eye, pushed them back, and said, "Not a chance." His face changed instantly. He smashed a mug, swept everything off the table, then deliberately injured himself right in front of me. I froze, convinced he'd lost his mind. The front door swung open. My wife walked in with our neighbor. "He attacked me," my stepson cried. My wife burst into tears as the neighbor grabbed my arms. I stood speechless. Exactly 40 minutes later, the police knocked on my front door. Out of everywhere you could be right now, you're here. That means a lot. I'd love to know which part of the world are you watching from. Drop your city or country below. Let's build something together. Just so you know, this story blends fictional elements into its telling for educational and entertainment purposes. Names and settings are coincidental, but the message underneath all of it, that part is yours to keep. My name is Thomas Mercer, and I am 72 years old. I know that's not the most exciting way to start a story, but I've learned that the most dangerous traps in life don't announce themselves with sirens and warning lights. They arrive quietly, dressed in warm smiles and home-cooked meals, and by the time you realize what's happened, you're already inside them. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer for the Tennessee Department of Transportation. Bridges, mostly. People don't think much about bridges, they just drive across them and go on with their day. But I thought about them every hour of my working life. Load capacity, stress distribution, the exact point at which something that looks solid begins to crack from the inside. I was good at spotting hidden weaknesses in steel and concrete. Turns out I was terrible at spotting them in people. My house on Clover Lane in Nashville had been my home since 1984. 3 bedrooms, a wide front porch, an oak tree in the backyard that Margaret and I planted a couple of years after Sarah was born. I built the back deck myself over one long summer weekend in 1991, and every plank of it was still solid 30 years later. That house was everything: 40 years of mortgage payments, of Saturday mornings fixing gutters, of Christmas lights Margaret insisted on hanging, even when it was 20 degrees outside. Margaret. My chest still does something complicated when I say her name even now. We met at Vanderbilt University in 1971. She was studying English literature, and I was buried in structural calculus, and somehow she thought I was interesting anyway. 35 years of marriage, and she never once let me feel sorry for myself, not even when things got hard. She passed in February of 2018. Pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. When Sarah finally had to go home to her own family after the funeral, she hugged me at the door and said, "Call me every single day, Dad." And I did for a while. Harold Smith from next door started coming over on Tuesday mornings. We'd sit on the back deck with our coffee and talk about nothing in particular: the Titans, the weather, the sorry state of the neighborhood association. He was the kind of man who said exactly what he meant, and meant exactly what he said. It was also around that time that Ray Calloway came to visit. Ray and I had been friends since our freshman year at Vanderbilt. He'd gone into private security engineering systems, surveillance, and visible infrastructure. Before he left Nashville that fall weekend, he pressed a lapel pin into my hand. Small bronze shaped like a compass rose. "It's got a tiny lens, tiny recorder," Ray said. "Battery lasts about 6 hours on a charge the doc's built into the case. Plug it in like a watch." He pressed a small flat case into my other hand. "Keep it charged. You never know." I laughed. I told him I was a retired bridge engineer from Nashville, not a spy. He shrugged and said, "Humor an old man." I put the pin in the pocket of my best charcoal gray suit jacket, the one Margaret had picked out in 2009, the one I only wore on days that mattered. I didn't think about the pin again for a long time. In January of 2020, Harold dragged me to a fundraising dinner at First Baptist Church on Broadway. I wore the charcoal jacket. I don't know why, habit maybe, or something I wouldn't understand until much later. Eleanor was standing near the dessert table. Dark hair beginning to go silver at the temples, dressed simply, no flashy jewelry. When she laughed, she pressed her fingers lightly over her mouth, like she was trying to hold the sound in. I was still standing there talking to her an hour later when Harold walked past and gave me a look that could only be described as insufferably pleased with himself. On the drive home, the bronze pin caught the passing streetlights and glinted once briefly, like a small eye blinking open. I didn't notice. Looking back now, I can see every warning sign I missed. They weren't hidden exactly. They were right there in front of me, the way a crack in a bridge support is right there in front of you. Obvious if you know what you're looking for and actually bother to look. But grief does something to a person's vision. It narrows it. After Margaret passed, I stopped looking at the world the way an engineer looks at it, critically, carefully, always asking what might fail and why. I started looking at it the way a tired old man looks at it, hoping things would hold. Eleanor made it very easy to hope. Our first real date was in February of 2023, weeks after the church fundraiser. She suggested a small Italian restaurant on 2nd Avenue that I'd driven past 100 times without ever going inside. We sat by the window, and she ordered the gnocchi, and she talked about her son Kevin, with a mixture of exhaustion and fierce love that reminded me painfully of the way Margaret used to talk about Sarah when Sarah was a teenager and driving us both absolutely crazy. "He's a good boy underneath all of it," Eleanor said, twirling her fork slowly. "He just needs direction. His father wasn't around much, and I think that left a hole in him that he doesn't quite know how to fill." "That's hard," I said, "for both of you." She looked at me across the table with an expression that made my chest feel like it was being carefully unwrapped after years in storage. "You understand things, Thomas," she said. "Most people try to fix everything. You just listen." I drove home that night with my hands tight on the steering wheel, and something warm and slightly alarming stirring behind my ribs. I was 68 years old. I had not expected to feel this way again. I wasn't entirely sure I deserved to. The next 6 months moved in a way that felt both slow and startlingly fast. We had dinner twice a week, then 3 times. She started calling me on Sunday mornings while I drank my coffee on the back deck, and those calls stretched from 20 minutes to an hour without either of us noticing. She brought me a peach cobbler one afternoon in April, completely unannounced, and set it on my kitchen counter with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had been doing that for years. "You didn't have to do that," I told her. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." I ate 2 servings standing over the kitchen sink like a man who had forgotten how to use a table. And I thought about Margaret's pecan pie, and I felt the guilt rise up the way it always did, sharp and sudden, like stepping on something in the dark. But underneath the guilt, quieter and more persistent, was something else. Something that felt against all my better judgment, like gratitude. Kevin came to dinner for the first time in May. He was 19, then tall, with Eleanor's dark coloring, and a watchfulness about him that I initially mistook for shyness. He shook my hand firmly, called me sir, and said very little throughout the meal. He ate efficiently, answered direct questions in complete sentences, and kept his eyes moving around the room in a way that I told myself was just a young man being alert. "He liked you," Eleanor told me afterward, washing the dishes while I dried. "He's just not great with new people." "He's fine," I said, and I meant it. I had no reason not to mean it. Eleanor and I were married in October of 2020. It was a small ceremony, just Harold and his wife Dorothy as witnesses, a judge at the Davidson County Courthouse, and lunch afterward at a steakhouse on West End Avenue. Eleanor had suggested keeping it quiet. "I don't want a big fuss," she said. "I just want it to be real." I agreed. It felt right, the simplicity of it. Margaret and I had a big wedding with 300 people, and I had no desire to repeat the performance. Sarah called the morning of to wish me well. Her voice was careful, warm, but careful the way you speak when you're choosing each word before you say it. "Are you happy, Dad?" she asked. "I think so," I said. "Okay." A pause that lasted just a beat too long. "I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart." Eleanor was sitting beside me on the couch when the call came in. Her hand rested on mine throughout the conversation, light, easy, the way you rest your hand on something that belongs to you. Kevin moved into the spare bedroom 2 weeks after the wedding. He carried his boxes and quietly arranged his room efficiently, and by the end of the first week had established a routine that kept him largely invisible out in the morning. Before I was up home, late brief appearances in the kitchen that felt like a military operation, in and out, mission accomplished. He still called me sir, never Thomas, certainly never anything warmer. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that not every family looked the same, and that this one was still new, still finding its shape. The tea started on our third night as a married couple. Eleanor appeared in the doorway of the bedroom with a small ceramic mug, steam rising from it. The smell drifting ahead of her, something herbal and faintly sweet like dried flowers, and something else I couldn't name. "What's this?" I asked. "Chamomile and a few other things," she said, handing it to me with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "An old family recipe. It's good for joints and circulation. My grandmother swore by it. You'll sleep better, Thomas, I promise." I wrapped both hands around the mug. It was warm in a way that traveled up through my palms and into my arms, and I was tired in the way that 68-year-old men are tired at the end of a long, emotional year, and so I drank it. She was right. I slept better than I had in months, deep and dreamless and long. I woke up feeling like something had been smoothed out inside me. I told Eleanor at breakfast, and she smiled and patted my hand and said, "Same time tonight." After she left the kitchen, I sat with my coffee and looked at the photograph of Margaret on the windowsill, the one from our trip to the Smoky Mountains in 1998. Her hair blown sideways by the wind, laughing at something I'd said that I couldn't remember anymore. "I think I'm okay," I told the photograph. My voice came out rougher than I intended, and my eyes burned in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. "I think maybe I'm going to be okay." I believed it too. That night, after I'd taken my tea and turned out the light, I heard Kevin's footsteps in the hallway outside my door. They stopped for a moment, just outside, close enough that I could see the shadow of his feet beneath the door. Then they moved on, quiet as smoke, and I heard his bedroom door close softly at the end of the hall. I told myself he was just heading to the bathroom. I pulled the blanket up, closed my eyes, and drifted down into the deep, smooth, dreamless dark that was already starting to feel less like rest and more like something being taken from me, though I wouldn't understand that for a long, long time. Eleanor never said anything terrible about Sarah. That's the part that took me the longest to understand, and the part that even now makes me feel the most ashamed. If she had walked up to me in those early months and said, "Your daughter only cares about your money," I would have shown her the door before she finished the sentence. I knew Sarah. I had raised Sarah. I would never have believed anything ugly about her if it had been delivered ugly. Eleanor was far too smart for that. It started so gently, I didn't feel it at all. We'd be sitting at the dinner table in January of 2021, maybe 3 months into the marriage, and my phone would ring Sarah's name on the screen, and Eleanor would glance at it and then glance away just quickly enough that I noticed. "Go ahead," she'd say. "Of course, answer it." But there was something in the way she said "of course," a barely there pause, a slight softening of her mouth, that planted a seed I couldn't even see germinating. Then 2 days later, Did Sarah ask about the house when she called conversational? Curious, not accusatory at all. She just seemed very interested in the neighborhood before we were married. I think she asked Harold about property values. I'm sure it was nothing. She always said that. And every single time she said it, it became something. That was how Eleanor worked. She never lied to me directly. She outsourced her lies to people I already trusted, and let those lies travel back to me through mouths I had no reason to question. I found out much later that she had fed Harold that story herself, and Harold, who had no reason to doubt his neighbor's wife, had repeated it back to me as though he'd witnessed it personally. By spring of 2021, I was answering Sarah's calls in shorter and shorter sentences. She'd ask how I was doing, and I'd say fine. She'd ask about Eleanor, and I'd give her polite, minimal answers, the kind you give to people you're not quite sure you trust. Sarah noticed. Of course she noticed. She was 35 years old, and she knew me better than anyone alive. "Dad," she said one evening in April, "is everything okay between us? You seem distant." Eleanor sat across the living room reading a magazine, not looking at me. But I was aware of her the way you're aware of something just at the edge of your peripheral vision, constantly, without meaning to be. "I love you, Dad," Sarah said. I told her I loved her too, and I meant it completely, but I said it in the clipped tone of a man already ending the conversation. I heard Sarah hear it. I felt her pull back. After we hung up, Eleanor looked up and smiled. "I just hope she's not stressing you out, Thomas. You've seemed tired after her calls lately. Have you noticed that—" I hadn't noticed it, but I did after she said it. She didn't create the things she wanted me to believe. She just pointed at the space where those things could exist, and my tired, grieving mind did the rest. Sarah came to visit in June of 2021, the last time she would set foot in the house on Clover Lane for over 3 years. Midway through dinner, Kevin remarked almost casually how the neighborhood had really held its value. The comment hung in the air like smoke. In the kitchen afterward, Sarah's voice was tight. "Something about this doesn't feel right, Dad. Please be careful." I told her she was imagining things. I said it kindly, the way you say things to someone you love when you are completely, catastrophically wrong. 4 months later, a letter arrived. Eleanor collected the mail every morning before I was up, a habit I'd found endearing, a small helpfulness I never questioned. She hid the letter behind the large mirror in the front hallway, the one that had hung there since 1987. She didn't destroy it, because she needed proof someday that Sarah had tried only once and gone quiet. That was the story she was building, a daughter more interested in inheritance than in her father. I believed it. God help me, I believed it. By December, Sarah stopped calling. I sat on the back deck that last night with Eleanor's tea, watching the oak tree creak in the winter wind, and thought, she'll call when she's ready. I pulled my coat tighter and went inside. The forgetting started small. That's what I kept telling myself in those early months, that it was small, that it was normal, that every man my age misplaced his keys sometimes and blanked on a name he'd known for 30 years. I was 70 years old. My body had been sending me memos about its limitations for the better part of a decade. A little cognitive fog seemed like a reasonable price to pay for 7 decades of living. But this was different, and somewhere beneath my reassurances, I knew it. It started in the spring of 2022. I went to the hardware store on Charlotte Pike to buy a box of 3-inch wood screws, the kind I'd been buying since 1979, and stood in the fasteners aisle for 4 full minutes, completely unable to remember what I'd come in for. Not the brand, not the size. The entire purpose of the trip gone like a word erased from a whiteboard. I drove home without the screws. I didn't tell Eleanor. By summer, the fog was thicker. I forgot the name of a colleague I had worked alongside for 11 years, Bill Garrett, who had given a speech at my retirement party that made half the room laugh and the other half reach for their napkins. His name simply wasn't there one morning. Nothing came for 3 days, then returned on its own while I was in the shower, and the relief was so complete my knees went weak against the tile wall. The most frightening episode came in October of 2022. I put a pot of water on the stove and walked into the living room, and forgot the stove was on, not for 5 minutes, but 45 until the smoke alarm shrieked, and I ran to find the pot, scorched, dry, thin black ribbons, curling toward the ceiling. My hands shook so badly moving it to the sink that I dropped it. I stood there with my heart slamming against my ribs and felt the first real wave of genuine terror, cold and specific, aimed at the question I did not want to ask. What is happening to my mind? Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She crossed the kitchen and steadied me with both hands. Come sit down. Leave it. My voice cracked when I told her I had simply forgotten. 70-year-old men who built bridges did not crack. She made me her chamomile tea and held my hands across the kitchen table until I stopped shaking, and I let her because I was frightened, and she was warm and she was there. 3 weeks later, she drove me to see Dr. Alan Foster on West End Avenue. What I didn't know was that Eleanor had arrived 15 minutes early and spoken privately with the nurse describing my forgetfulness, my confusion, alleged episodes of agitation. I had no memory of 2 occasions I had supposedly raised my voice at Kevin. By the time I walked into the examination room, the story of Thomas Mercer had already been written for me. Dr. Foster ran me through a standard cognitive assessment and told me carefully the picture was consistent with early-stage cognitive decline. Eleanor squeezed my hand and said, "He has good support at home." She asked for a copy of the diagnosis and folded it into her purse with the quiet efficiency of someone completing a task they had planned for a long time. Then came March 4th, 2024. Looking for scissors Eleanor had borrowed, I opened the small cabinet on her side of the bed, a narrow wooden thing I had never touched, because it was hers, and I respected that. The scissors weren't there. In the back of the upper drawer, beneath a folded silk scarf, was a small white unmarked box. No label, no pharmacy sticker. Inside, round, smooth tablets, completely unmarked. I stood holding it and felt something that lived in the neighborhood between suspicion and fear. Eleanor appeared behind me. Something moved behind her eyes, quick and cold, like a fish turning in dark water before it vanished. Those are my anxiety pills. Compounding pharmacy. Custom formulated. Her voice was smooth and warm as always. I put the box back, closed the drawer, and stood alone in the bedroom, staring at it, knowing something was wrong, unable to hold the thought before it dissolved. That night, Kevin came home late, smelling of bourbon. He looked at me from the bottom of the stairs and smiled slow and private, like a man enjoying a joke I wasn't in on. "Sleep well, old man." I sat with my book and felt the words swim and thought about unmarked tablets and tried very hard to hold on to something that kept slipping away. There is a particular kind of Tuesday morning in Nashville in July that feels like the world has decided collectively to be at peace. The air comes in through the kitchen window, warm and heavy, carrying the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the block, and the birds in the oak tree out back argue cheerfully among themselves, and the coffee maker hisses and spits in that familiar, reliable way that makes you feel briefly that everything in your life is exactly where it should be. That was the kind of morning it was. Eleanor had kissed me on the cheek at 7:15, told me she was going to the farmer's market on 8th Avenue, and left with her canvas bags over one arm and her car keys in the other. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her back out of the driveway, then turned back to my coffee and my crossword puzzle, and the particular pleasure of a quiet house on a warm summer morning. I had 4 across a 6-letter word for structural support, and I was working through the possibilities with the slow, satisfied focus of a man who has nowhere urgent to be when I heard Kevin's door open upstairs. 8:43. Kevin rarely came downstairs before 10. I set my pencil down. He appeared in the doorway a minute later, and something about the sight of him made my stomach tighten before my brain had finished processing why. He was actually dressed not in the t-shirt and sweatpants he usually wore before noon, but dark trousers and a collared shirt, with sleeves rolled to the elbows. His hair was combed. He crossed the kitchen without saying good morning and sat down across from me. Then he placed a document on the table between us, smoothed it flat with his palm, and slid it toward me. "I need you to sign this," he said. "Today, if possible. 40 years of engineering teaches you to read documents carefully. The dangerous parts are never in the headings. They live in the subordinate clauses, the fine print, the sections written in language so dry that a tired man skims right past them." I did not skim. It took me 4 minutes. What I was holding was a deed of trust as collateral, designating my home on Clover Lane as security for a debt of $47,000 owed to Meridian Capital Solutions, LLC, a post office box in Smyrna, Tennessee. No website, no named officer. Interest at 22% compounding monthly. One missed payment and foreclosure proceedings could begin within 30 days. I set the papers down. My hands were very still. "Kevin," I said, keeping my voice level, "what is this debt?" "Business investment. It didn't work out. Then find a different guarantor." His voice dropped lower, the careful neutrality cracking at its edges. "You're the only family I have here. Mom would ask you herself, but she doesn't want to put you in that position." I thought about Margaret not abstractly, but specifically the way I only thought about her when something important was happening. "The house is Sarah's future too, Thomas. Don't forget that." I folded the document and pushed it back across the table. "I built this house with 40 years of work," I said. "I'm not signing it over to a post office box in Smyrna, not for anyone." The appeal drained from his eyes, and something flat and cold replaced it. The same thing I had glimpsed briefly on the night he'd told me to sleep well. He picked up the document, straightened it with 2 sharp movements, and said very quietly, "Wrong answer, old man." He walked out. I heard him cross the living room, pick up his phone, and speak to someone in a voice I had never heard from him before, low, fast, stripped of all performance. The voice of a man reporting and telling someone that Phase 1 had not gone as planned, and it was time to move to something else. My coffee had gone cold. The crossword puzzle sat beside me, 4 across, still blank. I looked at the oak tree through the kitchen window. One of the birds that had been arguing so cheerfully in its branches had gone quiet. I picked up my pencil and wrote "anchor" in the boxes, a 6-letter word for structural support. Then I put the pencil down and waited, though I didn't know yet what I was waiting for. I heard him in the living room for maybe 2 minutes after that. His voice was low and fast, the kind of voice people use when they're giving instructions, not having a conversation. I couldn't make out the words from the kitchen, just the rhythm of them, short-clipped, confident. A pause. Then a few more words. Then silence. Then I heard something I didn't understand at first, a sound like furniture shifting, followed by what I can only describe as a controlled burst of energy, a series of deliberate movements that didn't match any normal activity I could account for. I set down my coffee mug and stood up. I was still standing when Kevin walked back into the kitchen doorway, except he didn't walk in the way he'd walked out. He came in fast with his shoulder leading, and before I could say a word, he swept his arm across the kitchen table and sent the crossword puzzle and my coffee mug flying. The mug hit the edge of the counter and shattered shards skittering across the floor tiles. Coffee, what was left of it, splattered across the cabinet fronts in a dark arc. I stumbled backward, my hip catching the edge of the counter, and grabbed the sink to keep from going down. The spoon I'd been using to stir my coffee was still in my hand. I hadn't even realized I'd picked it up. "Kevin," I started. He wasn't listening. He wasn't even looking at me the way a person looks at another person. He was looking at the room, at the mess he'd just made, at the broken mug, at the coffee running down the cabinet, with the rapid calculating focus of a director checking his set before the curtain goes up. And then he started hitting himself. I want to be precise about this, because I have replayed it in my mind so many times since that the details have become almost painfully clear. He did not lose control. There was nothing wild or frantic about what he did. He raised his right hand, closed it into a fist, and struck himself across the left cheekbone with the measured, deliberate force of a man who knows exactly how hard to hit to produce a specific result. He did it 3 times. Then he switched hands and hit the other side. Then he grabbed his own collar with both hands and tore at a sharp, practiced motion so that the fabric split from the neck almost to the shoulder. The sounds he made were not sounds of pain. They were something else entirely hollow, theatrical, the sounds a person makes when they are performing pain rather than feeling it. I stood at the sink with the spoon in my hand and felt my brain simply refuse to process what I was watching. 40 years of engineering, 40 years of looking at things and understanding how they worked, and I could not make my mind accept the information my eyes were sending it. The cognitive gap between what I was seeing and what I was capable of believing was absolute. Kevin looked up at me. His left cheek was already darkening, a bruise blooming under the skin with terrible efficiency. His lip was split at the corner, a thin line of blood tracing down toward his chin. His shirt hung open at the collar. His eyes were dry. Then the front door opened. Eleanor and Harold came in together. Eleanor with her canvas farmer's market bags still over one arm, Harold with a long-handled garden spade he'd come to return. Behind them, drawn by the sound of the mug shattering, Mrs. Patterson from 4 doors down had followed them through the open door, still in her garden gloves, her eyes wide. They stepped into the front hallway and stopped at the sight of the kitchen. The broken mug, the coffee on the cabinets, Kevin crumpled against the far wall, with his hands over his face. The sound Kevin made when he saw them was extraordinary. It came out of him like something that had been waiting, a wrenching, convulsive sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. The kind of sound that grabs a person by the base of the throat and squeezes. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor amid the coffee and the broken ceramic, his shoulders heaving. "Mom," he choked out. "Mom, I just asked him for a little help with tuition. And he just lost it. He grabbed the coffee pot and threw it at me. And when I tried to get away, He broke off, pressing his hands against his face again, his whole body shaking with the force of his sobs. I turned to Eleanor. My mouth was open. Words were somewhere in my chest, but the distance between my chest and my mouth felt insurmountable. Eleanor's face had gone white. Her canvas bags slipped from her arm and hit the floor. Her hands flew to her mouth. She stared at Kevin, then at me, then at the spoon in my hand. The spoon I was still holding. I realized because I had never once thought to put it down, and I watched something move across her face that I can only describe as the expression of a woman absorbing a terrible confirmation of something she had feared for a long time. "Thomas," she whispered. Her voice broke on my name in a way that was perfectly calibrated, not accusatory, not angry, just devastated. "Thomas, your doctor warned us. He told us this might happen, that the episodes could escalate." Mrs. Patterson moved before anyone else did. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and grabbed my arm with both hands, not gently, the grip of a woman who has decided she is preventing something, and pulled me back from the counter. "Thomas, stop," she said, though I hadn't moved an inch. She was looking at Kevin on the floor, at the spoon in my hand, at the coffee on the walls, and she was assembling the same wrong story everyone else was assembling, and I could see it happening in real time and could not stop it. She held my arm and looked at me with an expression of pure, horrified pity. "It's okay," she said. "It's okay, Thomas. Just breathe." I stood there in her grip, frozen, the spoon still in my hand, and felt the room close around me like a structure that has already decided to fail. Harold took one step into the kitchen and stopped. He was 67 years old and had spent 30 years delivering mail on the same streets in all kinds of weather, and he was not a man who rattled easily. But he was rattled now. His eyes went from Kevin to the broken mug to me, and I watched him do what any reasonable person would have done with the information available to them. In that moment, he believed what he saw. "Thomas," Harold said. His voice was careful, the way you're careful around something unpredictable. "Hey, just take a breath, all right." "Harold." My voice came out strange, too flat, too slow, like a recording of myself played at the wrong speed. "Harold, this isn't what It's okay," he said in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. "Just put that down." He nodded at the spoon. I looked at the spoon in my hand, as if seeing it for the first time. A teaspoon, stainless steel, the kind you find in any kitchen drawer in any house in America. I set it on the counter. Eleanor crossed the kitchen and knelt beside Kevin, pulling him against her, one hand cupping the back of his head, the way you hold an injured child. She was crying now, quiet, restrained tears that ran down her face without drama, without noise, the tears of a woman who had been holding herself together for a long time and was finally privately coming apart. "It's going to be okay, baby," she murmured into Kevin's hair. Then she looked up at me over his shoulder, and her eyes were full of a sorrow so perfectly composed it could have been painted. "I love you, Thomas. You know I do. But we have to get you some help." Kevin's sobs had softened to hitching uneven breaths. Harold was on his phone. I stood at the counter and felt the room tilt slightly, not physically, but perceptually, the way a room tilts when you realize that every object in it means something different from what you thought it meant 30 seconds ago. The canvas bags were still on the floor where Eleanor had dropped them. One of them had fallen open, and I could see what she'd bought at the farmer's market: tomatoes, a bunch of fresh basil, 2 peaches wrapped in brown paper. She had been planning dinner. She had known before she left this morning that she would be back in time to make dinner, and she had bought ingredients for it, and she had walked back through that door at the exact moment she needed to walk back through it, and none of that was an accident. None of it. But the thought dissolved before I could hold it, slipping sideways, the way all my thoughts had been slipping for 2 years, and I was left standing in my own kitchen, feeling like a stranger in it, with Harold looking at me like I was something fragile and dangerous, and Eleanor holding her son on my floor, and the spoon sitting on the counter where I'd set it down, harmless and absurd. Harold lowered his phone. His voice was gentle in the way that hurt worse than anger would have. "Thomas," he said, "I think I need to make a call." The knock came 40 minutes later, 3 clean raps on the front door, the kind that doesn't ask permission. The 2 officers who responded were professional and unhurried in the way that people are when they've been called to situations like this many times before and have learned that rushing doesn't help anyone. The younger one, a woman in her late 20s with her hair pulled back tight, took Kevin to the far end of the living room and spoke to him quietly, her notepad open. The older one, a broad-shouldered man named Officer Daniels, stayed in the kitchen with me. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away, and he asked his questions in a flat, even tone that felt less like a conversation and more like a process being executed. "Sir, can you tell me what happened this morning? My stepson came downstairs and asked me to sign a document," I said. I refused. He started damaging things. He hit himself. Officer. I watched him do it. I was standing right there, with a spoon in my hand, and I watched him hit himself in the face. Officer Daniels wrote something down. A spoon, he said. I'd been stirring my coffee, I said. I never moved from the sink. He nodded slowly in the way that people nod when they are recording information rather than agreeing with it. Then Eleanor appeared at the kitchen doorway and held out a folded piece of paper. Officer, I think this might be relevant, she said softly. It's from his doctor. We've been managing a diagnosis for about 2 years now. Officer Daniels took the paper. I watched his eyes move across it. I watched something in his posture shift, almost nothing. Just a degree or two the way a compass needle adjusts, and I felt the ground beneath me become slightly less solid. Mr. Mercer, he said, his voice careful now in a new way. Have you been under any particular stress lately? My jaw tightened so hard my back teeth ached. Officer, I am telling you that the young man in your living room hit himself. Deliberately. I watched it happen. Yes, sir, he said. I hear you. He did not in any meaningful sense hear me. Harold gave his statement at the front door, his voice low and reluctant, his eyes not quite meeting mine through the window. He told them what he'd seen when he walked in: the broken mug, the coffee on the walls, Kevin on the floor, with his face damaged. All of it true. All of it completely devastatingly misleading. The officers left an hour later without making an arrest. But they left with a report, a formal record of a domestic disturbance at my address with my name attached to it, and the words cognitive decline and escalating episodes already threaded into the narrative before I'd said 10 words in my own defense. Dorothy called 3 people before noon. Mrs. Patterson had already told 2 of them herself, her voice low and shaken, the voice of a woman who believed she had witnessed something terrible and needed to tell someone before it sat too long inside her. I didn't know that at the time, but I pieced it together over the following days from the way the neighborhood changed around me. It was subtle at first, the kind of subtle that you can almost convince yourself you're imagining. Mrs. Patterson from 4 doors down, who had waved to me every morning for 11 years from her driveway, did not wave on Wednesday. The Hendersons' teenage son, who used to stop and talk to me about cars when I was working in the garage, crossed to the other side of the street on Thursday afternoon without appearing to notice me. On Friday morning, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox. It was unsigned. It said, "Shame on you. We know what you did." I stood at the end of my driveway holding that note for a long time. My hand was not steady. The words blurred slightly at the edges, not from tears, but from a trembling I couldn't entirely control, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with fear of losing the house or fear of legal consequences. It was something older and quieter and far more painful than either of those things. I had lived on Clover Lane for 40 years. I had shoveled these neighbors' driveways after snowstorms. I had lent tools and jumped batteries and stood at enough backyard fences over enough summers to know the names of everyone's children and most of their grandchildren. This street was not just an address. It was the physical record of my adult life. Every house on it held some memory of Margaret, of Sarah, growing up, of the slow, ordinary accumulation of a life that had mattered. And now someone had put a note in my mailbox telling me they knew what I'd done. I folded the note and put it in my shirt pocket and went back inside. That evening, Eleanor came into the living room where I was sitting and perched on the arm of the sofa beside me. She smelled like the lavender soap she kept by the kitchen sink, and her expression was the expression of a woman carrying a burden she has chosen not to put down. "Thomas," she said, "I spoke with Dr. Foster's office today. They want to schedule a follow-up. After what happened yesterday, I think it's important." "Nothing happened yesterday," I said. "Nothing that I did." She reached out and put her hand over mine. Her palm was warm. "I know this is hard," she said. "I know you don't see it the way I see it. But I love you, and I am scared for you, and I need you to let me help you." My throat tightened with a grief so tangled I couldn't have named all its components. Part of it was rage. Part of it was loneliness. And part of it, the part that shamed me most, was the desperate, irrational wish that she was telling the truth, that she actually loved me, that the warmth of her hand was real. "I'll think about it," I said. She squeezed my hand and stood up. "I'll make you some tea," she said. She came back 10 minutes later with the ceramic mug, the nightly tea, the tea I had been drinking for 2 years, the tea that smelled like dried flowers, and something else I had never been able to name. She set it on the side table beside me and touched my shoulder gently. "Try to rest," she said. "Things will look better tomorrow." I picked up the mug. The warmth traveled up through my palms and into my arms the way it always did. I looked at the dark surface of the liquid. I thought about white tablets in an unmarked box. I thought about Officer Daniels writing something in his notepad after Eleanor handed him the paper. I thought about the note in my mailbox and Mrs. Patterson's driveway, and the 11 years of morning waves that had apparently meant nothing. For the first time in 2 years, I did not drink the tea. I sat with it in my hands until it went cold, and then I set it back on the side table, and I waited for Eleanor to come back and check on me, but she didn't. Through the wall, very faintly, I heard her laughing at something on the television in the bedroom. I have spent a lot of time since everything that followed trying to identify the exact moment I stopped being a man. Things were happening too, and started being a man who understood what was happening. It was that night. Somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning in the hallway outside my own bedroom, looking at my own window. I hadn't slept. I'd lain in bed for 3 hours with the cold tea still sitting on the side table beside me, staring at the ceiling, and listening to the house settle around me the way old houses do. The creaks and pops of wood contracting in the cooler night air. The distant sound of a car passing on Charlotte Pike. The particular silence of a home that no longer felt like mine. My mind kept circling back to the same points, the same images, Officer Daniels's notepad, the note in the mailbox. Eleanor's hand warm over mine on the sofa, the sound of her laughing at the television through the wall. At 2:15 I got up. I didn't turn on the light. Some instinct I couldn't have named kept me in the dark. I pulled on my robe. Out of a habit I couldn't entirely explain, the same habit that had made me wear the jacket. On the morning everything happened, I took the pin from the nightstand, where I'd left it, and clipped it to the robe's lapel. Then I walked to the window at the end of the hallway, the one that looked out over the backyard. The oak tree was a dark shape against the lighter dark of the sky. The yard was quiet. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, my forehead almost touching the glass. Then I heard voices from downstairs, low, close together, the murmur of a private conversation. Eleanor and Kevin. I hadn't heard Kevin come home. I glanced at the clock on the hallway wall, 2:22 in the morning. And that was when I saw them. Not directly, I wanted to be precise about this, because precision matters here. The hallway light downstairs was on, and its glow reached up the stairwell and caught the window glass at an angle, turning it into something like a mirror. A dark, imperfect mirror, the way old glass becomes reflective at night. In it, I could see a section of the downstairs hallway, distorted, compressed, the way reflections in old glass always are. And in that section of hallway, I could see Eleanor. She was standing at the bottom of the stairs. Kevin was beside her. They were speaking too quietly for me to hear the words, but I could see her face. She was smiling. Not the smile I knew. Not the warm, practiced, careful smile she wore in the daytime like a piece of clothing she'd selected for the weather. This was something else entirely, a smile that had nothing performing about it, nothing managed or constructed. It was the smile of someone who is genuinely pleased with themselves, satisfied, privately triumphant in the way that people are when something they have worked very hard toward has finally come together exactly as planned. She said something to Kevin. He nodded, and something in the set of his shoulders relaxed in a way I had never seen from him before, the tension going out of him, like air from a tire replaced by the loose ease of a young man who has done what he came to do. Then Eleanor looked up toward the stairs. Not at me, she couldn't see me in the dark, and she said clearly enough that the words carried up through the old house's bones. "Almost done, baby. The old man's losing everything." My hand came up and pressed flat against the wall beside me. Not for balance, I was steady enough. I pressed it against the wall because I needed to feel something solid and real and indisputably there, because everything else in my field of perception had just rearranged itself into a pattern so different from the one I'd been living inside that I felt physically disoriented, the way you feel when a piece of machinery you've trusted for years reveals a flaw you should have caught years earlier. They went to their rooms. The light went out. The house went dark and quiet again. I stood at the window and the pieces came together with the terrible, unstoppable logic of a structural calculation. The kind where once you've identified the correct load and the correct weakness, the numbers do the rest by themselves, and you cannot make them come out differently no matter how much you want to. The unmarked white tablets in the drawer, not anxiety medication. Something else. Something administered nightly in a ceramic mug, something that made you sleep too deeply and forget too easily and become over time pliable in ways you didn't recognize because the change was so slow and so consistent that it felt like aging rather than intervention. The doctor's appointment. Eleanor arriving early, speaking to the nurse shaping the story of Thomas Mercer, before Thomas Mercer walked through the door. Cognitive decline. A diagnosis written into a file that could then be produced for police officers, for judges, for anyone who needed a reason to disbelieve me. This morning, Kevin rehearsed, timed the farmer's market bags already packed. I thought about Sarah, not with the dim, deflected guilt of the past 3 years, but with a clarity that felt like a light being switched on in a room I had kept shut for too long. My daughter, who had looked at me across a dinner table with tears she refused to let fall, and said something doesn't feel right, had been correct. She had been correct on the very first visit in the very first year, and I had stood in my own kitchen and told her she was imagining things. My eyes burned and my throat worked, and I pressed my hand harder against the wall. I needed to reach her. I needed to reach her right now, tonight, before one more day passed, in which she didn't know what was happening to her father. I went back to the bedroom and opened the drawer of my nightstand. Behind the spare reading glasses and the box of antacids and the folded map of the Smoky Mountains that Margaret had kept from our 1998 trip, my hand found the small, hard rectangle of the old Nokia, the backup phone I'd had since 2015 and never told Eleanor about, charged by habit every few weeks on a small adapter I kept in the same drawer. I turned it on under the blanket, shielding the light with my body like a teenager hiding something from his parents. The screen glowed green, battery at 4%. I pulled up Sarah's number, still there, still the same, unchanged, because the old phone had never been wiped. My thumb hovered over the call button. My whole hand was trembling, not from fear, but from the particular physical sensation of a person who has been holding something in for a very long time, finally allowing themselves to let it go. I pressed call. 1 ring. The screen flickered. A second ring began and died in the first syllable. The screen went black. 4% had not been enough. I lay back against the pillow in the dark, with the dead phone against my chest and I felt a grief so complete and so specific that it had its own weight, the grief of a man who has finally understood the full dimensions of how badly he has failed the people who loved him, and who is not sure he will be given the chance to make it right. Outside, the oak tree moved in a breath of warm night wind. I closed my eyes and did not sleep. I made a decision before the sun came up. I lay on my back in the dark with the dead Nokia against my chest, and I thought about it with the same methodical care I had once applied to load-bearing calculations, identifying what I knew, what I didn't know, what I could prove, and what I couldn't. By the time the first gray light began to show around the edges of the bedroom curtains, I had arrived at the only conclusion the numbers supported. I could not act yet. I had nothing. A reflection in old glass, a sentence I'd heard through a ceiling, a box of unmarked tablets that Eleanor had explained away smoothly enough to satisfy a police officer. If I confronted her now, she would pivot. She would adjust. She had been building this for years, and whatever she had built, I had not yet seen all of it. The worst thing I could do was let her know I'd seen any of it. So I got up, showered, went downstairs, and made coffee. Eleanor came down at 7:30. She kissed me on the cheek and asked how I'd slept, and I told her better, thank you. And she smiled and said she was glad, and I smiled back. It was the most difficult thing I had done in years, standing in my own kitchen, smiling at the woman who had said the old man's losing everything and giving her absolutely nothing to work with. She picked up my phone from the counter to plug it into the charger by the refrigerator, a small, helpful gesture she performed every morning, and in the 30 seconds her back was turned to me, I watched her thumb move across the screen in a pattern that was not the pattern of someone plugging in a charger. It was deliberate, the rapid navigation of someone who had already downloaded the application and needed only to install and activate it. She set the phone down and turned back to the stove, and I looked at the phone on the counter and understood that something had just been added to it. Something she didn't want me to notice. Something designed to run quietly in the background, recording waiting. I picked the phone up. I went to the settings menu, moving slowly, as if I were simply checking something, as if my hands weren't tight with the effort of appearing casual. In the list of installed applications between the weather app and the calculator was something called Voice Catch Pro, installed at 7:31 that morning. I set the phone back down on the counter. For the next 11 days, Eleanor ran her operation, and I let her run it. She would ask me the same question twice, Thomas. Did you take your blood pressure pill? Thomas, did you take your blood pressure pill? And when I answered the second time with an edge of impatience in my voice, I knew that edge was being recorded. She moved my reading glasses from the arm of the sofa to the kitchen counter, and when I couldn't find them and said so, my voice raised in frustration, I knew that was being recorded too. She burned the toast one morning, and when the smoke alarm went off, and I said, Eleanor, for God's sake, recorded, I was being assembled piece by piece into a version of myself I had never been. Thomas Mercer, 72, volatile, confused, threatening. A man whose own doctor had documented his deterioration. A man whose own neighbors had seen what he was capable of. A man who needed to be removed from a situation before someone got hurt. I understood this, and I could do nothing to stop it. Because the moment I said, I know what you're doing, she would deny it, produce the recordings, and the story would shift to, you see, he's paranoid now on top of everything else. What I could do, the only thing I could do, was find a way to reach Sarah. On the 8th day, while Eleanor was in the backyard on a phone call, I used the landline in the kitchen to call Ray Calloway in Phoenix. He picked up on the second ring. Thomas. His voice was the same as it had always been, steady, unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years anticipating problems before they arrived. I got your message. I've been waiting for you to call back. Talk to me. I talked fast and low with one eye on the back window. I told him enough, not everything, but enough. The recordings, the doctor's visit, the morning in the kitchen, the sentence I'd heard through the glass. Ray was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "The pin. Tell me you've been wearing the pin." I touched the lapel of the charcoal jacket hanging on the hook by the door. "Some days," I said. "I wore it the morning it all happened." "Then you may have more than you think," he said. "Thomas, listen to me. Do not confront her. Do not change your behavior, and call your daughter, today. Use a neighbor's phone, a payphone, anything that isn't in that house. Do you understand me?" "Yes," I said. "I mean it. Call her today." I heard the back door handle turn. I said, "Thank you, Ray," in a normal voice, and hung up before Eleanor stepped inside. I called Sarah that afternoon from the Shell station on Charlotte Pike, using the phone behind the counter, while Danny, the young man who worked the day shift, pretended to reorganize the cigarette display behind me and gave me every minute of privacy he possibly could without being asked. Sarah answered on the first ring. When she heard my voice, she made a sound that broke something open in my chest, a short, involuntary sound, half relief and half the kind of pain that comes from waiting a very long time for something you were afraid might not come. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked straight down the middle of the word. "Sarah," I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." I told her everything I knew. She listened without interrupting, and I could hear her breathing change as I talked, getting faster, tighter, the breath of someone whose worst fears are being confirmed one by one. When I finished, she didn't cry and she didn't panic. She said in a voice that had gone very quiet and very hard, "Dad, don't do anything. Don't confront her. Don't let her know you know. I have someone watching already, and what you've just told me changes everything. I'm going to make some calls tonight." "Sarah, I've got you, Dad," she said, and the fierceness in her voice made my eyes sting so badly I had to press the back of my hand against them. "I promise you, I've got you." I walked back to the house on Clover Lane and made dinner, and sat across the table from Eleanor and Kevin, and ate my food, and answered questions in even unremarkable sentences, and thought about the charcoal jacket on the hook by the door, and about Ray's voice saying, "You may have more than you think." 3 days later, a yellow envelope appeared wedged between the storm door and the front door of my house. I opened it on the front porch because something in the weight of it told me not to open it inside. It was an emergency order of protection issued by the Davidson County Circuit Court, citing documented incidents of domestic violence, medical evidence of an unstable mental state, and testimony from a neighboring witness. It stated that Thomas Allen Mercer was prohibited from remaining at or returning to the property at his address on Clover Lane effective immediately. He was to vacate the premises within 4 hours. A law enforcement officer would be present to oversee the transition. I read it twice. My hands did not shake this time. My jaw was set, and my eyes were dry, and something inside me had gone very still and very cold. Not the cold of despair, but the cold of a man who has done the math and knows exactly what comes next, even if he doesn't want it to. I folded the order and put it in my shirt pocket next to where the anonymous note had been, and went inside to pack a bag. Eleanor stood at the top of the stairs, watching me cross the hallway. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. I packed one bag. The charcoal jacket with the bronze pin on the lapel I folded carefully on top. Before I tell you what happened that night, a 72-year-old man, one bag, $23, standing alone on a dark road that used to lead home, dropped the word home in the comments to let me know you're still here with me. A note. The story continuing from here contains fictional elements crafted for storytelling purposes. Some details may not reflect any specific events. If that's not for you, it's okay to step away now. But if you're staying, I think you'll want to see how this ends. The officer who oversaw my departure was named Reyes. He was young, late 20s, maybe 30, and he had the decency to look uncomfortable about the whole thing, which I appreciated more than I could have explained to him. He stood in the front hallway while I carried my bag downstairs. He didn't offer to help, and I didn't ask him to. Eleanor stayed at the top of the stairs the entire time, one hand resting on the banister, watching me move through the house I had owned for 40 years, with the composed, slightly sorrowful expression of a woman attending a funeral she had organized herself. Kevin was nowhere to be seen. His door was closed. From behind it, I could hear the low pulse of music, something with a heavy bass line, unhurried, almost celebratory. Officer Reyes walked me to the front door and held it open. I stepped out onto the porch. The evening air hit me warm and thick, the way Nashville air gets in July when the heat of the day is still releasing from the pavement and the trees and the brick of the houses. Cicadas in the oak tree. A dog barking somewhere down the block. The smell of someone's dinner coming through a screen window. I stood on the porch of my own home for the last time and did not look back. I walked. There was no particular plan in the walking. I simply moved because standing still on that porch felt like a kind of defeat I wasn't prepared to accept. My bag was not heavy. One change of clothes, my blood pressure medication, my wallet with $23, and my driver's license and a photograph of Margaret I kept behind my library card. The charcoal jacket folded on top with the bronze pin on the lapel. Charlotte Pike was quiet at that hour. A few cars passed headlights sweeping across me without slowing. I was a 72-year-old man walking alone on the side of a road at dusk with a bag over his shoulder, and not one of those cars stopped. That is not a complaint, it is simply what happened. The Shell station was 6 blocks from the house. The lights of it were visible from 2 blocks away, that particular flat white fluorescence that makes gas stations look the same everywhere in America at night, like little outposts of sameness in the dark, which is either comforting or depressing, depending on your circumstances. That night to me it looked like the only lit window in a very large building. Danny was behind the counter when I pushed open the glass door. He was 19 or 20, with the kind of unhurried calm that some young people have that has nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with having seen enough of life's complications not to be surprised by new ones. He looked at me, looked at my bag, looked at my face, and said nothing about any of it. "Can I use your phone?" I asked. "I'll make it quick." "Go ahead," he said, and slid the handset across the counter without being asked twice. I called Ray first. The phone rang 7 times and went to voicemail. I left a message short, controlled the voice of a man who has decided that falling apart is not currently on the schedule. "Ray, it's Thomas. I'm out of the house. I'm at the Shell station on Charlotte Pike. Call me when you can." I hung up, pushed the handset back across the counter. Danny disappeared into the back room and came out 2 minutes later with a paper cup of coffee, black from the pot, behind the counter that was probably 4 hours old and tasted like it. He set it in front of me without commentary, without the expression of someone performing an act of charity. He set it down the way you set something down in front of a person because they need it and it costs you nothing to provide it, and that was all. "Thank you," I said. "Sure," he said, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. I carried the cup outside and sat on the low concrete curb at the edge of the parking lot, my bag beside me, and drank the coffee slowly. It was terrible. It was also the best thing I had tasted all day because it was real and hot, and nobody had put anything in it. The cicadas were going strong. Across Charlotte Pike, the lights of a subdivision I had driven past 10,000 times glowed warm and domestic behind their tree lines, and I thought about all the ordinary evenings happening inside those houses, dinner being cleared, children being put to bed, couples watching television, and I felt the distance between myself and all of that as a physical sensation, like standing on the wrong side of a glass wall. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the summer of 1991, when I built the back deck, and how she had brought me lemonade every hour, exactly setting it on the sawhorse without a word, because she knew I didn't like to be interrupted when I was working, and how the lemonade was always cold, because she timed it that way. I thought about the way she laughed at my jokes, even when they weren't funny, and the way she didn't laugh at them when she was tired, and how I had always been able to tell the difference. I thought about the oak tree we planted together, and how it had grown from something smaller than my arm into the thing with the cicadas in it. Now 38 years of growing in a yard, I was no longer permitted to enter. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my wrist against them hard enough to feel it. Then I thought about Sarah. 5 years old, sitting on my knee at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, blowing on her hot cocoa before every sip, because she'd burned her tongue once and never forgotten it. 15, furious at me over something I couldn't now remember, slamming her bedroom door hard enough to rattle the picture frames in the hallway. 25, calling me from Memphis to tell me she'd passed the bar exam, her voice so high and bright with happiness that I'd had to sit down. 35, standing in my kitchen doorway, with tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, telling me something doesn't feel right. Dad and me telling her she was imagining things. I had not deserved her then. I was not sure I deserved her now. I reached into the bag and found the charcoal jacket. I didn't put it on, the evening was too warm for that. I just held it in my lap, and my thumb moved across the lapel until it found the bronze pin, and I held that too, small and solid and cool against my thumb. In case you ever need to see something twice, Ray had said. I pressed the pin between my thumb and forefinger and thought, please let it have seen something worth showing. The parking lot of the Shell station was not a large place, and the night beyond it was very dark, beyond the fluorescent lights, and I was a 72-year-old man sitting on a concrete curb with a paper cup of bad coffee and a jacket in his lap. And for approximately 4 minutes, I allowed myself to feel every bit of that fully and without flinching. I had been sitting on that curb for 2 hours, long enough for the parking lot lights to feel familiar, long enough for Danny to bring me a second cup of coffee without being asked when I heard a car slow down on Charlotte Pike. The headlights swung into the parking lot. A dark blue sedan Tennessee plates a Memphis parking sticker on the rear bumper that I recognized before I recognized the car. And before I recognized the car, I was already standing up, my heart slamming against my ribs with a force that made my breath go short, because I knew whose car it was, and knowing whose car it was meant that she had come and that she had driven 3 hours in the dark to come, and that despite everything I had done and failed to do, she had come anyway. The door opened. She looked older than I remembered. That was my first thought. Not a cruel one, just an honest one, the kind you have when you haven't seen someone in 3 years, and time has moved on their face the way it moves on everyone's quietly and without asking permission. Sarah was 38 years old, and she looked like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time without putting it down. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before, and the way she held herself squared up chin level reminded me with a physical jolt of Margaret at the same age. She crossed the parking lot in 6 steps and put her arms around me, and I felt the full force of it, not a gentle hug, not a careful one, but the kind that a person gives when they have been terrified for a long time. And the thing they were terrified of losing is suddenly against all reasonable expectation right there in their arms. My bag dropped to this pavement. I held on to my daughter in the parking lot of a Shell station on Charlotte Pike at 9:15 at night, and my eyes burned so badly I had to squeeze them shut, and my throat locked up around everything I needed to say, and what came out instead was just her name once in a voice I barely recognized as my own. Sarah. I'm here, Dad. Her voice was muffled against my shoulder. I've got you. I'm right here. We stood like that for a long moment. Then she pulled back and looked at my face, really looked the way a doctor looks, cataloging, and her jaw tightened and her eyes went bright with tears she refused to let fall. "You look thin," she said. "I'm fine. You look thin and exhausted, and you've been sleeping on whatever she gave you every night for 2 years." Her voice cracked on the last 4 words. She pressed her lips together hard, got it back under control. "We're going to fix this. I promise you we're going to fix this, but right now we need to get you in the car." She picked up my bag herself before I could reach for it, and put it in the trunk with the efficient, decisive movements of someone who had been mentally rehearsing this moment for a long time. I got in the passenger seat. She got behind the wheel. She handed me a bottle of water from the cup holder without being asked. "Drink that," she said. I drank it. She pulled onto Charlotte Pike and headed for the interstate. And I watched the lights of Nashville fall behind us, and I thought about the fact that I had lived in that city for over 50 years and was leaving it in the passenger seat of my daughter's car with 1 bag and $23, and I felt something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but existed in the complicated space between the two. Sarah talked while she drove. Not about Eleanor, not yet. She told me about Lily and James, about a science project Lily had won a ribbon for, about James losing his first tooth, and the elaborate tooth fairy operation that had required 2 adults and a flashlight. She told me these things in a voice that was warm and steady, and clearly intended to do something specific, remind me that there was a world outside the house on Clover Lane, that it had been continuing without me, and that it had a place in it where I was wanted. It worked. Somewhere around Columbia, Tennessee, the tightness in my chest began very slowly to ease. We arrived in Memphis at midnight. Sarah's house was a brick colonial on a quiet street lined with old maples, lights left on in the front room. She had barely unlocked the door when James appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, hair flattened on one side from his pillow. "Grandpa!" He came down the stairs at a speed that made Sarah say his name in a warning tone, and then he hit me at approximately knee height and wrapped both arms around my legs with a grip that a much larger person would have been proud of. "Mom said you were coming. Are you going to stay? Can you tell me a bridge story?" My throat closed entirely. I put my hand on the top of his head, warm from sleep hair, soft and fine, and managed, "Yes, I'll tell you a bridge story." "Tomorrow," Sarah said, firmly steering him back toward the stairs. "Grandpa needs to sleep." "But, James Allen, I will count to 3. He went, but he looked back twice over his shoulder with the expression of a 6-year-old who considers this deeply unjust. Sarah got me settled in the guest room, brought me a glass of water and 2 crackers, because she said I needed something in my stomach, and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me the way you look at something you have been afraid of losing. "Sleep," she said. "I mean it. We'll talk in the morning." "Sarah, morning, Dad." She closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of her guest room and felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding himself upright through sheer will for days and has finally arrived somewhere he is allowed to stop. I was almost asleep when I heard Sarah's voice from down the hall, low, quick, professional. On the phone. I couldn't make out words, only tone, and the tone was the tone of someone receiving information that mattered. The call lasted 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the nightstand. When it ended, I heard her footsteps in the hall, then a long pause outside my door. Then her footsteps moving away. In the morning, she sat across the breakfast table from me with both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who has made a decision about how to deliver something difficult. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something about Eleanor, about who she was before she was Eleanor Mercer." She set her mug down. Last night I got a call from a detective. Her name is Carla Moss. She works elder abuse cases for Nashville PD, and she's been building a file on Eleanor Walsh that's Eleanor's real name before she changed it for the better part of a year. I looked at my daughter across the table. "Tell me," I said. Sarah took a breath. 8 years ago in Phoenix, Arizona, Eleanor did this before. A man named Gerald Hatch, 74 years old, retired electrical engineer widower. She married him, isolated him from his sons, and over 3 years took everything: his house, his retirement accounts, everything. He ended up in a care facility. She paused. Her voice dropped. He passed away 2 years later, alone. The kitchen was warm and bright, and smelled like coffee and maple syrup from James's breakfast. And I sat in it, and felt the full weight of what she had just said settle across my shoulders, like something physical. "She walked away," I said. "From Phoenix. Gerald didn't have enough evidence." Sarah reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and her grip was tight enough that I could feel her pulse. "Dad, this time she does." Sarah had made an appointment before she left Memphis to come get me. That was the thing about my daughter that I had forgotten in 3 years of Eleanor's careful erosion. She didn't react to crises, she prepared for them. While I had been sitting on that concrete curb outside the Shell station, waiting for something to happen, Sarah had already been 2 steps ahead, the way she had been apparently for the better part of a year. Dr. Patricia Nguyen ran an independent practice in East Memphis, a small, unhurried clinic on Poplar Avenue that smelled like coffee and antiseptic, and the particular quiet of a place where people came when they needed answers rather than reassurance. She was 45, precise in her movements, with the manner of someone who had learned to deliver difficult information directly and without decoration because she had found that people preferred it that way. She shook my hand and said, "Mr. Mercer, Sarah's told me the situation. Let's find out what we're dealing with." She drew blood herself, 4 vials labeled and sealed with the efficiency of someone who understood that the chain of custody on these samples mattered. She explained while she worked that the samples would go to a CLIA certified laboratory, the federal standard for medical testing facilities, whose results are admissible as legal evidence in Tennessee courts. Not just a doctor's office analysis, something that would hold up in front of a judge. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Several things," she said. But based on what Sarah described, the progressive memory impairment, the unusual depth of sleep, the gradual increase in suggestibility over 2 years, I have a specific hypothesis. She pressed a cotton ball to the inside of my elbow and looked at me steadily. "We'll know in 48 hours. The results came back in 36. Sarah was at the kitchen table when Dr. Nguyen called. I watched my daughter's face as she listened, watched it go from focused to still, to something harder and colder than I had ever seen on her before, a kind of controlled fury that she kept perfectly in place through the entire conversation, only the whitening of her knuckles around the phone giving it away. She thanked the doctor, set the phone down, and looked at me. "Scopolamine," she said, "also called hyoscine. It's a prescription compound legal in controlled medical doses for motion sickness and certain surgical applications. In sustained low doses administered over months, it causes progressive short-term memory impairment, increased disorientation, and something called heightened suggestibility, which means the person becomes significantly more likely to accept false information as true." She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "She's been putting it in your tea for at least 18 months, probably longer. The lab found accumulated metabolites consistent with long-term exposure." The kitchen was very quiet around us. James was at school. Lily was at school. The maple tree outside the kitchen window moved in a slow morning breeze and threw shifting pattern of light across the table, and I sat in those patterns of light and felt the full meaning of what Sarah had just said settle into me. 18 months. Every night. Every ceramic mug set on my side table with a warm smile and a gentle touch on my shoulder. Dad? Sarah's voice pulled me back. Dad, look at me. I looked at her. Her eyes were bright and fierce and full of something that was not quite tears, too hot for tears, too focused. She almost got away with it, Sarah said. But she didn't, because of this. She reached across the table and picked up the charcoal jacket I'd brought in from the guest room that morning. She turned it until she found the lapel, and her fingers closed around the bronze pin. She looked at it for a moment, this small, unremarkable thing that Ray Calloway had pressed into my hand on a doorstep in 2019, and something moved across her face that I couldn't entirely name. Relief, maybe, and something older than relief. She took the pin to her laptop. I sat across from her and watched her work, her fingers moving with careful precision, navigating to the pin's companion application, transferring the stored footage. The footage it had captured on the morning everything happened, when I had dressed in the charcoal jacket, because it was the anniversary of the day I met Margaret, and I always wore it on days that mattered. The video began to play. The angle was from chest height, slightly downward, wide enough to capture most of the kitchen. The timestamp in the corner read the date and time with mechanical indifference. And there I was, standing at the sink, a teaspoon in my hand, watching Kevin walk into the frame. I watched Kevin look around the room. I watched him sweep his arm across the table. I watched him with cold and methodical deliberateness strike himself across the face once, twice, 3 times, and I felt my stomach turn, not because it was new information, but because seeing it from the outside made it simultaneously more real and more incomprehensible than it had been when I was standing 6 feet away watching it happen. Sarah made a sound, low and involuntary, like the sound a person makes when they step on something unexpected. She pressed her hand flat on the table. "Keep watching," I said. The video continued. Eleanor and Harold came through the front door. Kevin collapsed. Eleanor performed. And then, in the final 90 seconds, in the lower right corner of the frame, Eleanor turning in the hallway, with the document, handing it to Kevin, Kevin signing. Sarah paused the video. She leaned forward and expanded that section of the frame until the document filled the screen. She stared at it. Her face had gone very still, in the way that faces go still when a person is processing something that changes the shape of everything around it. "That's a quitclaim deed," she said. "That's the house, Dad. She had him sign a quitclaim deed with your forged signature. She was transferring ownership of your home to Kevin." She looked up at me, and her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but absolutely without trembling. "She wasn't just going to take you for everything in the divorce. She'd already moved to take the house before the divorce was finalized." "Can you prove the signature is forged?" I asked. "I know a forensic document examiner." Sarah was already reaching for her phone. "Court qualified. If that signature doesn't match your handwriting under analysis, we'll have it in writing within a week." She paused with the phone in her hand and looked at me across the laptop screen. "Dad, I need you to hear something. We have the video. We have the blood work. We're going to get the handwriting analysis. Detective Moss has the Arizona file." She set her hand over mine on the table, warm and steady and certain. "We have her. Do you understand me? We have her." My hand turned over under hers and held on. "I wanted to call the police that same afternoon." Sarah put both hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was 16. And I was about to make a decision she considered strategically unsound. "Dad," she said, "sit down. I need you to think like an engineer for a minute, not like a father." I sat down. "If we go to the police right now, Eleanor gets a warning," she said. She's had years to prepare contingencies. The moment she knows we have the video, the blood work, the deed, she moves money, she destroys evidence, she disappears. She did it in Phoenix. She knows how. Sarah leaned forward. But if we let her walk into that courtroom, believing she's already won, believing we have nothing, she'll put every piece of her fraud on the record herself. In front of a judge, under oath. I looked at my daughter across the table and felt something shift in my chest, not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized itself in her. You want to let her think she's winning, I said, until the exact moment she isn't. Sarah's eyes were steady. Can you do that? Can you wait? How long? The divorce petition is already filed. Given the asset value and the contested nature, a hearing date in Davidson County Circuit Court will take roughly 3 months to schedule. She picked up her coffee. 2 months and 3 weeks, give or take. 3 months. I thought about Gerald Hatch in Phoenix, who had waited too long and run out of time entirely. I thought about the oak tree in the backyard of Clover Lane growing without me. Then I said, "Tell me what I need to do." Detective Carla Moss arrived at Sarah's house 2 days later. She was 42, compact and direct, with the particular alertness of someone who had spent years listening to people describe things that had been done to them, and had learned to hear what wasn't being said as clearly as what was. She shook my hand with a firm, businesslike grip and sat down at the kitchen table with a folder that she did not open immediately. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I want to be straightforward with you. Eleanor Walsh has been on my radar for 14 months. The Phoenix case left a pattern in the database, same MO, same target profile, same timeline. When her name came up in a Davidson County filing, I started building a file." She looked at me evenly. "What Sarah has given me in the last 48 hours has changed this from a file into a case." She explained the charges. Elder financial abuse under Tennessee Code Section 39-14-112, elevated to a Class B felony, carrying 8 to 30 years. Aggravated assault by poisoning under Tennessee Code Section 39-13-202. Forgery of the quitclaim deed, Class D felony. Conspiracy. With the Arizona pattern introduced under Tennessee Rule of Evidence 404B, prior bad acts, establishing a pattern of behavior. Eleanor Walsh was looking at a sentencing exposure that Moss described with professional understatement as significant. "What about Harold?" I asked. Moss set her hands on the table. "Harold Smith accepted payment from Eleanor Walsh to provide false witness testimony. That's obstruction of justice and perjury, both serious charges." She paused. "I spoke with him yesterday. He's scared and he's genuinely remorseful. I've offered him a cooperation agreement, full immunity from prosecution, in exchange for a complete, truthful recantation of his testimony at the civil hearing. He took it. She looked at me carefully. "I think he'd have recanted without the immunity, but the agreement ensures he follows through." I thought about Harold, 67 years old, 30 years delivering mail on these streets, a man who said exactly what he meant, and had meant, apparently, to do something he would spend a long time regretting. I didn't have the energy for anger. What I felt was something more tired than that. A disappointment that had already begun quietly to make its peace with itself. Sarah refilled everyone's coffee. Outside, the maple trees threw long afternoon shadows across the yard, and somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up that particular American summer sound that means ordinary life is continuing at its ordinary pace, regardless of what is happening at your kitchen table. "Eleanor's lawyer sent a waiver proposal this morning," Sarah said, sitting back down. She slid a document across to me. "She's offering to drop the criminal complaint, the domestic disturbance report, if you sign away all rights to contest the asset division. She gets everything. You get to walk away without a formal record. I looked at the document. Neatly typed. A clean, efficient instrument designed to make theft look like compromise. I pushed it back across the table without picking it up. "No," I said. Sarah's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. Moss nodded once, a short, satisfied movement. "The hearing date came through this morning," Moss said. "Davidson County Circuit Court, October 14th. She closed her folder. "That gives us just under 3 months. We'll be ready." The weeks that followed had a strange double quality on the surface, quiet and ordinary. Underneath, a slow, careful accumulation of purpose. Sarah went to work each morning. I got the children to school. I learned where the good coffee was in East Memphis, and which route through Audubon Park had the least traffic, and how James liked his eggs on Saturday mornings, scrambled, never runny, with exactly 2 pieces of toast cut on the diagonal. One evening I sat with James on the back porch after dinner while Sarah washed up inside. He'd been asking about bridges for a week, and I'd been putting him off, and that evening he climbed up beside me on the porch swing and looked at me with the patient, expectant expression of a 6-year-old who has decided to wait you out. "Okay," I said. "One bridge story." His face broke into a grin so wide it was almost architectural. I told him about the first bridge I ever designed, 1978, a 2-lane crossing over a creek in Rutherford County that nobody famous had ever driven across. I told him about the calculations, the site surveys, the way the ground shifted after a rain, and what that meant for the footings. He listened with the total, uncomplicated attention that children give to things when they have decided the person talking to them is worth listening to, and by the end of the story, his head was leaning against my arm, and his eyes were half closed. "Grandpa," he said sleepily. "Yeah, buddy. When the bad stuff is over, are you going to stay?" My throat tightened around the answer. I put my arm around him and looked out at the Memphis evening, the fireflies starting up in the yard, the sky going that particular deep blue that comes right before dark. "I'm working on it," I said. He seemed to find that acceptable. He was asleep before Sarah came to the door to tell us it was bath time, and I sat on the porch swing with my grandson's weight against my side and thought about October 14th and what it would take to walk into that courtroom and finish this. I thought I was ready. I almost was. The Davidson County Circuit Court on 2nd Avenue North was a building that took itself seriously. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, the smell of old paper and floor wax, and the particular institutional gravity of a place where consequential things had been decided for a long time. I had been inside courtrooms before depositions, a contract dispute years ago, the routine bureaucratic passages of a long professional life. But I had never sat at the respondent's table in my own divorce proceeding, and I had never understood until that moment how much difference a table could make. On one side of the room, you were a person. On the other, you were a case. Judge Raymond Holloway had been on the bench for 19 years. He was 60 years old, lean with wire-rimmed glasses, and the expressionless efficiency of someone who had heard every variety of human difficulty and had learned to process them without editorializing. He looked at both tables with the same level measuring attention, and I found that I was grateful for his impartiality, even as I was terrified by it. Sarah sat beside me, her yellow legal pad in front of her, her pen uncapped. She had worn a charcoal blazer, the same shade almost exactly as the jacket I'd draped over the back of my chair. She caught me noticing and gave me the smallest possible nod. I turned back to the front. Eleanor came in with Marcus Bright at 9:02. I had not seen her in 3 months, and the sight of her still did something complicated to my nervous system, not love, not anymore, but the ghost of it, the muscle memory of 4 years of believing in her. She was dressed simply, a gray dress, low heels, no jewelry, except small pearl earrings that managed to suggest both modesty and suffering simultaneously. She moved with a slight, careful slowness, as though everything hurt a little, and she did not look at me when she sat down. Marcus Bright was 50 years old and looked like a man who had never lost a case he thought he should win. He was tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair and the smooth, practiced confidence of someone who charged $400 an hour and considered it a bargain. He arranged his papers with unhurried precision and said something to Eleanor in a low voice that made her nod and dab at her eye with one finger. Harold sat in the gallery behind Eleanor's table. He was wearing a jacket I had never seen before, dark blue, slightly too large, and he looked like a man attending his own execution. His hands were folded in his lap, and his eyes were fixed on the middle distance with the rigid focus of someone who was working very hard not to look at anything in particular. Judge Holloway called the room to order, and Marcus Bright rose. He was good. I will give him that. He moved through his opening with the calm, inexorable pace of someone laying a foundation, each piece placed deliberately. Each connection made clearly, building a structure designed to support one conclusion and make any other seem structurally impossible. He spoke about Thomas Mercer's documented cognitive decline, his volatility, his escalating episodes. He produced the incident report from the morning in my kitchen, official stamped real. He produced the photographs of Kevin's injuries, the bruising, the split lip, and had them displayed on a screen at the front of the courtroom. I looked at those photographs, and my jaw tightened until my back teeth ached. He played the recordings. There were 4 of them. 30 seconds each, maybe 40 carefully selected moments in which my voice, stripped of all context, sounded exactly like the voice of a man coming unhinged. The moment the smoke alarm went off, and I'd said, "Eleanor, for God's sake." The time she'd asked me 3 times in a row if I'd taken my blood pressure medication, and I'd finally said, "I already told you twice. Please stop asking me." 2 others I couldn't immediately place, moments so ordinary I hadn't even registered them as moments. In the gallery, someone shifted in their seat. In my chest, something was happening that I could not entirely control, a pressure building behind my sternum, not quite pain, but close to it, the physical manifestation of sitting still while a careful, expensive lie was constructed around you in a room full of people who had no reason to doubt it. Sarah's hand found my arm under the table. She didn't grip it, just rested her fingers there, light and steady, and I focused on that pressure and kept my face exactly where it needed to be. Marcus Bright straightened his jacket and addressed Judge Holloway directly. "Your Honor, my client has endured 4 years of documented psychological and physical abuse at the hands of a man whose mental deterioration has rendered him dangerous to himself and to those around him. She has protected him, advocated for him, arranged his medical care, and received violence in return." He paused for exactly the right length of time. "Mrs. Mercer respectfully requests full ownership of the marital home at its current appraised value of $380,000, transfer of all retirement accounts totaling $340,000, and spousal support of $4,000 per month for a period of not less than 5 years. $720,000. Everything I had built. Everything Margaret and I had saved. The house on Clover Lane where Sarah had grown up, where I had laid every plank of the back deck myself on a summer weekend in 1991. Judge Holloway made a note. He looked at me over his glasses. "Does counsel for the respondent have anything to present?" he asked. Eleanor, at that precise moment, turned her head and looked at me for the first time since she'd walked in. Her expression was exactly what it had always been, composed, sorrowful, perfectly managed. But underneath it, so brief, I might have imagined it, except that I knew her face better than I had ever wanted to, was something else. A flicker. a satisfaction so complete and so private that it was almost intimate. She thought it was over. Marcus Bright was already settling back in his chair, with the easy confidence of a man who has given his closing argument and is waiting for the room to catch up. Sarah rose to her feet beside me. She was calm in the way that a well-built bridge is calm, not because nothing is happening, but because everything that was designed to happen is happening exactly as intended, and the structure is holding. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "We do." She reached into her briefcase and produced a flash drive. She held it up for a moment, small, unremarkable, the kind of thing you could buy at any drugstore in America for $8. Marcus Bright looked at it with the politely skeptical expression of a man who was not yet worried. He would be worried very shortly. "Before I show you what was on that flash drive, before everything Eleanor built came apart in front of a room full of people who finally saw her for what she was, comment the word justice below so I know you made it this far. One more note. What follows contains fictional elements woven into the narrative for dramatic and educational purposes. If you'd rather not continue, this is a good place to stop. But if you've come this far with Thomas, you deserve to see the ending." Sarah walked to the clerk's table and handed over the flash drive with the same matter-of-fact composure she might have used to hand over a library book. The clerk inserted it into the courtroom's audio-visual system. The large screen at the front of the room, the same screen that had displayed the photographs of Kevin's injuries 20 minutes earlier, flickered and came to life. "Your Honor," Sarah said, turning to face Judge Holloway. "This footage was recorded on the morning of the incident in question by a personal security device legally worn by my client, Thomas Mercer, on his own property. Tennessee is a one-party consent state, which means that Mr. Mercer, as a party to the events being recorded in his own home, was fully within his legal rights to capture this footage. The device's timestamp has been verified by a third-party forensic technician whose certification I have provided in the supporting documentation." Marcus Bright was on his feet. "Your Honor, we have not had the opportunity to review this material or verify its authenticity." "The authentication documentation was included in the discovery filing submitted to opposing counsel 14 days ago," Sarah said, without raising her voice or turning to look at him. "Page 47 through 52. A pause. Something moved across Marcus Bright's face, brief, controlled, but unmistakable. He sat back down. Judge Holloway looked at both of them over his glasses. "We'll proceed," he said. "Play the footage." The video began. The angle was from chest height, slightly downward wide, and the quality was better than anyone in that room had probably expected from something the size of a lapel pin. The timestamp burned in the lower left corner, the date, the time, 8:47 in the morning. And there was my kitchen rendered in clean, indifferent detail, the table, the counter, the cabinet, fronts, the window with the oak tree visible through it. And there was Kevin. He walked into the frame from the right, and the first thing that was apparent, the thing that would have been apparent to anyone watching, was that he moved with purpose. Not the loose, directionless movement of a young man losing his temper. Something organized. Something aimed. The audio caught his voice clearly. "Wrong answer, old man." Then he began. He swept the table with his arm, and the camera captured it in full, the deliberate trajectory of the gesture, the slight pause before it, the way his eyes moved to the door before he moved to the table. He hit himself across the face with his closed fist, and the camera caught that too. The angle of the blow, the clinical precision of it, the way he assessed the result, with a brief downward glance before hitting the other side. The room around me had gone very quiet, not the ordinary quiet of people paying attention. Something different. The kind of silence that descends when a room full of people has just understood something simultaneously, and none of them have yet decided what to do with it. I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I could hear the scratch of Judge Holloway's pen stopping mid-note. I looked at Harold, at Mom. He was staring at the screen with the expression of a man watching the ground fall away beneath his feet. His hands, which had been folded so carefully in his lap when the session began, had separated, one gripping the back of the bench in front of him, knuckles pale, the other pressed flat against his own thigh, as if he needed to feel something solid. His mouth was slightly open. He was breathing through it. On the screen, Eleanor and Harold walked through the front door, and Kevin collapsed, and the performance began. And now, watching it from the outside, watching Eleanor's hands fly to her mouth, with that perfectly timed gesture of horror, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and much sadder. The particular sadness of seeing something you had believed in fully revealed as a construction, and understanding that the belief itself had been real even if the thing believed in wasn't. Kevin was on his feet at the gallery railing. "That's the angle makes it look." His voice was too loud for the room, and cracked in the middle of the sentence in a way that made several people in the gallery turn to look at him. "That's not what—" "Sir." Judge Holloway's voice was not loud, but it had a quality that ended things. "Sit down." Kevin sat down. His face had gone the color of old concrete. Marcus Bright leaned toward Eleanor and said something in a rapid undertone. She was staring at the screen. Her canvas market bags, the ones she'd brought home from the farmer's market on the morning of the incident, had been in the front hallway, visible at the edge of the frame in the video's final moments. I had not noticed that detail before. I noticed it now. So apparently did Judge Holloway. His pen had begun moving again. Marcus Bright rose. "Your Honor, given the complexity of this new material, we request a brief continuance to allow our team to—" "The material was provided in discovery 2 weeks ago," Counselor Judge Holloway said without looking up from his notes. "The request is denied. Continue, Ms. Mercer." Sarah had not sat down. She had not moved from the center of the room. She stood with her legal pad at her side and her eyes on the judge, and she waited for the room to finish absorbing what it had seen, and when she judged correctly, precisely, that it had, she spoke. "Your Honor, that was the footage from the morning of July 7th. She paused. A single beat. "We have a second piece of footage from the same device recorded later that same evening." Marcus Bright's pen stopped moving. Eleanor turned her head slowly, as if her neck had stiffened, and looked at her lawyer. It was the first time in the entire proceeding that her composure had produced a visible seam. The expression she turned on Marcus Bright was not the expression of a client checking in with her counsel. It was the expression of someone who has just realized that the exit they planned for is no longer where they left it. I watched her realize it. I watched the exact moment her certainty began to come apart, not dramatically, not in a collapse, but in the way that certainties come apart, when the evidence against them becomes undeniable quietly, in the eyes, in the slight slackening of a jaw that has been held very carefully in place for a very long time. Harold made a sound. Low, involuntary, the sound a person makes when something long dreaded has finally arrived, and the waiting at least is over. He pressed his fist against his mouth and stared at the screen, and did not look away. "Play the second video," Judge Holloway said. The second video lasted 47 seconds. It showed a section of the downstairs hallway at night, dim, slightly grainy in the low light, the quality of footage taken when the only illumination was the glow from the stairwell. Eleanor stood at the bottom of the stairs, with Kevin beside her, their voices clear enough in the quiet house to be captured without distortion. The room heard her say it. "Almost done, baby. The old man's losing everything." And then her smile. Caught by a lens she didn't know existed in a house she believed she controlled completely. In a moment she would have sworn no one else would ever witness. Not the smile I had known for 4 years, not the warm, constructed, carefully maintained expression she wore in daylight. This was something private and satisfied and cold in a way that had nothing performing about it whatsoever. The room did not make a sound, not a shift, not a cough, not the scratch of a pen. The ventilation system hummed. The timestamp in the corner continued its indifferent count. And Eleanor Walsh sat at the plaintiff's table with every person in that room, looking at her, and for the first time in 4 years, she had absolutely nothing to say. Her face had gone white. Not pale white, the specific absence of color that happens when blood leaves a face all at once when the body understands something before the mind has finished processing it. Sarah moved without pausing. She spoke the way a structure bears load steadily, without drama, distributing weight across a foundation designed to hold it. "Your Honor, we have 4 additional items of evidence." She nodded to the clerk. "The first is a toxicology report from a CLLIA-certified laboratory, confirming the presence of scopolamine, a controlled pharmaceutical compound, in Mr. Mercer's bloodstream, at levels consistent with sustained, deliberate administration over a period of not less than 18 months. Dr. Patricia Nguyen of East Memphis Family Practice is present today to answer any questions the court may have regarding the medical findings." Dr. Nguyen, seated in the gallery, raised her hand briefly when Judge Holloway looked her way. He nodded and made a note. "Scopolamine in sustained low doses," Sarah continued, "causes progressive short-term memory impairment, disorientation, and significantly heightened suggestibility. The cognitive decline documented in Mr. Mercer's medical record, the record submitted as evidence by opposing counsel, is fully consistent with deliberate chemical poisoning rather than natural neurological deterioration. The source of administration based on Mr. Mercer's account and the timeline of his symptoms was a nightly herbal tea prepared and provided exclusively by the plaintiff." Marcus Bright had stopped writing. His pen was in his hand, but it was not moving, and his eyes were doing something I recognized from engineering reviews when a structural calculation comes back wrong, recalculating rapidly with numbers that are not cooperating. "The second item," Sarah said, "is a forensic handwriting analysis conducted by a court-qualified document examiner whose credentials and methodology are detailed in the supporting materials. The analysis compares the signature appearing on a quitclaim deed filed with the Davidson County Register of Deeds and purporting to transfer ownership of Mr. Mercer's property to Kevin Walsh against verified exemplars of Mr. Mercer's actual signature. The examiner's conclusion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, is that the signature on the deed is not Mr. Mercer's. It is a forgery." She placed the document on the clerk's table. Then she placed a second one beside it. The quitclaim deed in question was captured on the same camera footage already admitted into evidence, specifically in the footage from the morning of July 7th, in which the plaintiff can be seen presenting the document to Kevin Walsh for his signature, while Mr. Mercer was still present in the kitchen. She looked at Judge Holloway directly. The deed was filed with the county recorder's office 4 days after that morning. Mr. Mercer had already been removed from the property under the order of protection by that time and was therefore unable to contest it. Judge Holloway's expression had not changed, but he had been writing continuously for the last 3 minutes, and the quality of his attention had shifted in a way I could feel from across the room. Less the attention of a judge managing a civil proceeding, more the attention of a judge who understands that the civil proceeding in front of him is the surface of something considerably more serious beneath. "Third," Sarah said, "Detective Carla Moss of the Nashville Police Department Elder Abuse Unit is present today to provide testimony regarding a prior pattern of conduct." She gestured toward the gallery. Detective Moss stood navy blazer, no expression, and gave her name and badge number for the record. 8 years ago in Phoenix, Arizona, Eleanor Walsh, the plaintiff's legal name prior to her marriage to Mr. Mercer, engaged in a substantially identical course of conduct against a 74-year-old widower named Gerald Hatch. Mr. Hatch lost his home, his retirement savings, and died in a care facility 2 years later. Ms. Walsh was never prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. The documentation of that case has been provided to this court and to the Davidson County District Attorney's Office under Tennessee Rule of Evidence 404B, establishing a pattern of predatory behavior. Eleanor's lawyer put his hand on her arm. She shook it off. She was staring at Detective Moss with an expression I had never seen on her before, stripped of every layer down to something raw and cornered. Kevin had gone very still in his seat. His earlier outburst seemed to have left him, and in its place was a rigid, concentrated stillness, the stillness of a young man running calculations of his own and not liking the results. Harold had arrived that morning, accompanied by a court-appointed attorney provided under the terms of his cooperation agreement, a quiet man in a brown jacket who gave him a single nod when Harold glanced over his shoulder. Then Harold Smith stood up. He rose slowly from the gallery bench directly behind Eleanor's table, and when he was fully upright, he looked like a man who had made a decision that was costing him something real and had decided to pay it anyway. Your Honor. His voice was rough but steady. I need to correct my earlier testimony. Marcus Bright turned in his chair. Eleanor turned. The entire room turned. Harold did not look at any of them. He looked at Judge Holloway, and he spoke clearly. 2 days before the incident at Thomas's house, Eleanor Mercer came to my home. She gave me $500 in cash and told me that if anything happened between Thomas and her son, she needed me to say I saw Thomas get out of control. His voice thickened, but did not break. I took the money. I needed it. There was damage to my roof after the storms in June, and I couldn't cover it. I told myself what I'd be saying was probably true anyway. A pause. It wasn't true. I know what I saw when I walked into that kitchen. I didn't see Thomas hit anyone. I saw a broken mug and a boy on the floor, and I told myself the story that fit what Eleanor had already put in my head. He stopped. His hands were shaking at his sides. I'm sorry, Thomas. I am deeply sorry. The room had the quality of held breath. Eleanor pushed back her chair. The legs scraped against the floor, and the sound was very loud in the silence. Order, Judge Holloway said, not loudly, but with a finality that settled the room like a hand placed flat on a vibrating surface. He looked down at his notes for a long moment. Then he looked up. He looked at Eleanor Walsh, and whatever he saw in her face in that stripped, cornered, white-knuckled expression told him everything the paperwork had not yet finished saying. He reached for his gavel. Judge Holloway struck the gavel once. The sound was not dramatic. It was a single, clean wooden knock, the sound of a door closing on something that had been open too long. He removed his glasses and set them on the bench in front of him, and looked at the room with the unhurried attention of a man who has arrived at a conclusion and is taking a moment to be certain of it before he speaks. The court finds the evidence presented by the respondent to be credible, substantive, and materially dispositive of the claims before this court. All claims by the plaintiff are denied in their entirety. The emergency order of protection issued against Thomas Allen Mercer is hereby vacated. The quitclaim deed filed with the Davidson County Register of Deeds is declared void and without legal effect as it bears a forged signature. Full title to the property on Clover Lane reverts to Mr. Mercer effective immediately. He set his pen down. Furthermore, this court is referring the matters disclosed in today's proceedings to the Davidson County District Attorney's Office for review and appropriate action. The clerk will prepare the referral documents. He looked at Eleanor over the bare bridge of his nose without the mediation of his glasses. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down again. For a moment, no one moved. Then Marcus Bright began gathering his papers methodically, without expression, the movements of a professional who has learned to pack up and leave cleanly, regardless of the outcome. He did not speak to Eleanor. He did not look at her. He closed his briefcase, straightened his jacket, and walked out, and I watched him go, and thought that whatever she had paid him, it had not been enough for this. Eleanor stood. She gripped the edge of the table with both hands, and I watched her try to arrange her face into something workable, and watched her fail at it for the first time in 4 years. What was there instead was not anger, not grief. It was the expression of a person who has built a very careful structure and watched it come apart in a single hour and cannot yet process the absence of it. Kevin pushed past her toward the main door. He got as far as the hallway. Detective Moss was waiting with 2 uniformed officers positioned on either side of the corridor, with the patient efficiency of people who had been there for some time and were always going to be there. Kevin stopped when he saw them. The calculation on his face lasted approximately 2 seconds before it resolved into something that was not quite resignation, but lived right next to it. Moss read them their rights. Eleanor first, then Kevin, her voice clear and unhurried in the marble corridor. The words of the Miranda warning are not dramatic in themselves. They are procedural formal, designed for clarity rather than effect. But standing in the doorway of the courtroom, watching those words be spoken to Eleanor Walsh, I felt their weight in a way I never had before. You have the right to remain silent. Eleanor did not look at me. She stared at the middle distance with her wrists held in front of her and her chin level. And even now, even in this, she was trying to manage how she appeared. The muscle memory of performance still running long after the audience had stopped believing it. Kevin looked at me, just once briefly before the officer turned him toward the elevator. His expression was not what I expected. Not anger, not defiance. Something younger than either of those things, something that might in a different life with different choices made by the people responsible for shaping him have been capable of becoming something better. I did not hold that look for long. I turned away. Sarah appeared beside me and took my arm. We walked back into the courtroom to collect our things. Harold was still there on the gallery bench, bent slightly forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor between his feet. He heard us and looked up. His face was the face of a man who has done the right thing and discovered it does not feel the way he imagined it would. There was relief in it, but relief is a complicated thing when it arrives carrying the full weight of what it cost to get there. Thomas, he said. His voice came out rough. I don't expect you to. I know I don't deserve. He stopped, started again. I am sorry for all of it. I should have trusted what I already knew about you. I looked at him for the long moment. 67 years old, 30 years of mail, 100 Tuesday mornings on my back deck. A man who had done a weak and frightened thing, and then when it counted had stood up anyway. I know, Harold, I said. Not, it's okay. Not I forgive you. Just I know. It was all I had, and I meant every word of it. He nodded once and looked back at the floor. Sarah steered me toward the door. The courthouse steps came out onto 2nd Avenue North, and when I pushed through the heavy door and walked into the October air, the sunlight hit me like something physical, warm and direct, and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened inside the way sunlight always is. The trees along the avenue had started to turn orange and gold against the gray of the buildings, and the air carried that dry leaf smell that meant summer had finally finished with itself. I stopped on the top step. Sarah stopped beside me. She said nothing, not because there was nothing to say, but because she had always known when silence was the right instrument. I looked at the street. I looked at the trees. I breathed. My hand found hers, without either of us deciding it would, and I felt her fingers close around mine, warm and certain, and there the way they had been on so many ordinary days of her childhood, that I had never thought to be grateful for until I nearly lost the chance to remember them. I thought about Margaret, about 35 years, about whether I had ever told her clearly enough what those years had meant. She would have liked this, I said. Sarah's hand tightened around mine. Yeah, she said, her voice rough at the edges. She would have. We stood there a moment longer. Then Sarah took a breath. You said you wanted to see the house. One more time. I do, I said. We went down the steps together. We had not reached the bottom when I heard my name. It was Mrs. Patterson, 4 doors down, 11 years of morning waves. The woman who had not waved on the Wednesday after everything happened. She was standing on the sidewalk below, both hands pressed flat against her sternum, her eyes red at the rims. Beside her stood Gerald Henderson, and behind him 2 or 3 others from the block, whose faces I had known for decades, wearing expressions I did not quite have a word for, something between grief and the relief of people who have been shown they were wrong and are not too proud to say so. Mrs. Patterson crossed the distance in 6 steps and put both arms around me without a word. She was a small woman, and she held on with a fierceness that caught me completely off guard. I stood on those steps with my arms around my neighbor and felt something ease in my chest that I had not known was still knotted. I'm sorry, Thomas, she said, her voice muffled against my jacket. I am so sorry. I know, I said. The same 2 words I had said to Harold. I was finding they were the truest ones I had. Gerald took my hand in both of his, the grip of a man trying to return something he had a part in taking away. The others offered their own versions of the same thing, each in the halting way of people who are not practiced at apologizing, and are doing it anyway because it was owed. I thanked every one of them and meant it without reservation. Sarah stood a few steps apart, giving me the room for it. When the gathering finally broke up and we turned toward the car, she said nothing. She did not need to. Some things do not require commentary. They only require that someone who loves you stands close enough to witness them. The house on Clover Lane looked exactly the same. That was the first thing that struck me when Sarah pulled up to the curb, how completely indifferently unchanged it was. The oak tree in the front yard had dropped leaves onto the walkway, orange and gold against the concrete, and the flower boxes Eleanor had planted in the spring were overgrown, now the petunias gone leggy and brown from a week of nobody tending them. But the house itself stood exactly as it had stood for 40 years, brick and white trim, and the wide front porch where Margaret had drunk her coffee every summer morning, apparently unbothered by everything that had happened inside it. Sarah handed me the key the locksmith had cut that morning after the courthouse, after the paperwork, returning the property to Thomas Allen Mercer. I turned it once in my palm. Then I went up the front walk. The door opened on a house that smelled like someone else. Eleanor's lavender soap, Kevin's hair product, the chemical sweetness of an air freshener in the hallway outlet. 4 years of another life had settled into the walls, and I stood in my own front hallway and felt like a guest. I walked through it slowly. The kitchen first. The cabinet fronts where coffee had splattered in July had been scrubbed clean. The broken mug replaced with one I didn't recognize. The coffee maker Eleanor had bought 6 months into the marriage sat on the counter. She had not felt the need to take it, which told me something about how certain she had been of the outcome. I ran my hand along the kitchen table. 40 years of breakfasts. Sarah doing homework here. Margaret paying bills here. The Sunday crosswords I never finished because Margaret always got there first and filled in the easy ones in pen, which she knew drove me absolutely crazy, which was entirely why she did it. The living room. The back deck through the sliding door planks I had laid myself in 1991, still solid, not a single board sprung. The oak tree throwing long afternoon shadows across the grass. I went upstairs. Margaret's photograph was still on the nightstand. Eleanor had not moved it. I picked it up, the Smoky Mountains 1998, her hair blown sideways, and put it carefully into my jacket pocket. Downstairs, I stopped in front of the hallway mirror. Dark wood frame hung there since 1987. I put both hands on the frame and pulled it from the wall. The envelope was taped to the back with a single strip of yellowed tape. My name in Sarah's handwriting. Postmark, November 2021. 3 years. 3 years it had waited here, 18 inches from where I had stood 100 times, while Eleanor passed it every single day and said nothing. I sat down on the floor and read it. When Sarah came through the front door and found me there, she sat down beside me on the floor without a word, her back against the same wall, her shoulder touching mine. We stayed like that for a long time. Then she straightened up, wiped her face, and said simply, "Okay." I called the real estate agent from the kitchen. 45 seconds. I'm ready to list. Yes, as soon as possible. We carried things out. Margaret's photograph books, tools from the garage. Sarah loaded the trunk. I stood on the front porch one last time and looked at the oak tree, the back deck, the ordinary street where I had lived an ordinary life for 40 years. I took the bronze pin from my lapel and held it in my palm. Small, solid, cool against my skin. It had seen exactly what it needed to see. I set it on the porch railing gently, deliberately, the way you set down something that has done its job. "You sure?" Sarah asked from the bottom of the steps. "I don't need it anymore," I said. We got in the car. As Sarah pulled away, I looked back once the oak tree, the white trim, the railing where the pin was already too small to see. Then I faced forward. Memphis was 3 hours away. Somewhere around Columbia, James called to ask if we were almost there. And when I said, "It's Grandpa Buddy," he made a sound so purely delighted that it felt like something being repaired in my chest, something small and specific and important. "Can we have bridge stories when you get here?" he asked. "As many as you want," I said. Eleanor's facing trial. Kevin, too. I think about Gerald Hatch sometimes, a man who went through all of this alone with no one waiting in the dark. I feel grateful in a way that sits right next to grief, because that is where gratitude usually lives. I believe God put that pin in Ray's hand for a reason. I have stopped looking for another explanation. Here is what I know. Now, loneliness is a door that swings both ways. It can let in warmth. It can let in wolves. Don't do what I did. Don't let grief make you careless with your trust. The people who love you quietly, who stay close without making noise, those are the ones worth holding on to. This has been one man's family story, imperfect, painful, and worth telling. If these grandpa stories reminded you of someone you love, pick up the phone today. Don't wait for a parking lot in the dark to remember what matters. If this family story moved you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss the next grandpa stories we have coming. Every family story here is told with one purpose: to remind us what we are fighting to protect. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for one purpose: to illuminate real human truth. If that is not for you, we understand. But if you are still here, we are glad.